number 4, we have equitable policing discussion. We're actually going to push data collection to the next meeting. So just make note of that we'll adjust that to our next meeting. In addition, when we, at our last meeting, we had spoke about needing some extra time to work through this part of the Equity Task Force items, I guess I should say. And so tonight we'll be here until 7. It won't be a hard stop, right? We're going to do our best to end at 7, but if we're in the middle of a conversation or a thought, we'll finish that and then we'll close out the meeting and carry on to our next meeting. We just want to respect everybody's time and make sure everybody has an opportunity to participate. And that's hard if we say we're going to end at 7 and suddenly we carry on until 8:30 or 9 o'clock. So we're going to do our best to stick to that time frame this evening. So with that, do I have anybody to move to approve the July 23rd, 2021 minutes? Okay, it's been, motion has been made but seconded, approval of the July 23rd, 2021 minutes. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed, please say no. The motion has passed. Next on the agenda is a consultant's presentation. So we're going to have some conversation with our consultant this evening around the approach to equitable policing. And so I think that's you, right, Mr. Newkirk?
It is, unless I've been demoted, which is possible. Okay. Okay. All right. Can I take my mask off to present? Is that okay?
That's absolutely fine. You bet.
Okay, fully vaccinated, but that's not the only thing, but I get it. Okay, so the purpose of this presentation is simply to kind of set the stage so we can have a more efficient conversation and move this task force forward to getting to a point of making recommendations to the city council. And so we don't lose the ground that everyone's gained. I'm going to try and move very quickly because I don't want to take time from all of you having a discussion about these issues. That's not the purpose. So I'm going to cover some things that I think are important to kind of cut to the chase, and then we can get back to the discussion from all of you who are on the task force. So I think it's important to recall, what is the role of this task force? You know, the goals, as I understand them from when this task force was created, to ensure Marion embraces diversity and inclusion, to advance equitable and inclusive policies, practices, and processes, and to align with the city's goal of creating a vibrant, welcoming community that is accessible to all residents and visitors. Now, you need to remember that's your goal and to also recognize your challenges and context with that role, I believe. There are limits on what a city can do and what it simply cannot do. I think we've had discussions over the summer about, you know, that the city can't affect certain types of state level policies or county level policies, but there are things that the city does have power over that this task force can make recommendations on. Simply some problems, as I've said, are too systemic for the city to solve, a city of 40,000 people to solve, but it can make progress within the context of the goals of the task force. So what I'm recommending is that getting to the point of making progress and recommendations and making a report to the city council here in the near future, and then ensure continuous improvement on their recommendations going forward. At some point, you've got to come to a point of closure. So what can a city do? Manage its message to the public through its webpage and public statements. The city's already doing that to some extent. The webpage is in pretty good shape. It is inclusive, it shows diversity. It has similar messages that can always be upgraded, but you're making progress on that front. Manage your personnel, hiring, promotion, pay, that sort of thing. Increasing welcomeness for minorities who, in terms of being hired and recruited, things like that. The city's approach is being reviewed and evaluated. There's been a hiring of a new HR director to make that happen. Manage policies, reducing risk points, things that Mr. Pluckham mentioned last time, the 10 points of risk, or the top 10 ways that, you know, bias or impact can sneak into policies, and the city's implementing those changes. Managing ordinances, laws, rules, and boards and commissions. And I think that the evaluation via the equity lens that was been designed by this or proposed by this committee or this task force is going to be helpful in that front. And then, of course, managing public safety, which is our goal here today, hiring retention of a more diverse workforce, and of course, the public interaction with public safety, equitable policing. That is the simplification of what a city can do or cannot do with regard to equity and diversity and inclusion and equitable approach to safety. It's watered down, but at some point you've got to get your brain around it. Otherwise, you can't make progress. We have made more progress than we think. I know I've talked to all of you at different times, and there've been doubts about how long it's taken and progress, but we've committed to policy and practice reviews, as I've mentioned. There's better data collection that's coming on both the city internally, but also within the police department, and better training on implicit bias and cultural awareness, and increased implicit bias training across the board. And of course, a strong commitment to public safety data collection, which is a key that I'll talk about. Use of body cams and highly detailed data on the methods and methodologies of policing. And in my view, this is the primary source of ensuring equitable policing. If you look at every single study across the country that finds good or bad things about how policing is done, data collection is the #1 failure and the #1 thing you need to do. And the city is on its way to making that happen. I think it's over 800,000 in budget commitments on that issue alone. At some point, you're going to wait for the implementation of these changes and then review that data collection down the road. More detailed, the city has been working to address the matters within its control. Again, personnel, they hired an HR director and streamlined the policies and practices. They're reviewing the policies by the HR director. Council's already completed a review of that and will work with me to review to ensure there are no other risk points in that going forward. Increased accountability through data collection, as I mentioned, and the boards and commission review through the equity lens. The Alliance, the MAR has provided 3 proposals that they've asked to consider. These are the providing from the mental health liaison, which is already on its way or should be completed. The addressing more openness and welcoming attitude of city toward minorities, and that's effectively handled by the personnel and policy and practice changes listed above. And then of course, the addressing profiling or equitable policing, which we are here today to discuss. And the task force has identified some citizen members develop the equity lens, and the need for methods to communicate all of these changes and progress to the public in an effective way so that the purpose and goal of the task force is served. And then of course, equitable policing, which is what we're here for. Chief Kitzmiller is working on a number of items, and this relates to the Alliance proposal #1, which was addressing profiling equitable policing. So I go through that briefly because again, one of the biggest barriers making progress in my experience has been the failure to keep one's eye on the prize and to realize what can be done and that the tasks can be accomplished and move forward in an effective way. And you are all much closer to that than you think you are. So effectively, we're going to talk about the equitable policing today. Hopefully get some closure on mental health. That may not be discussed today, but I think it's time to close that down and get the more significant and difficult issues on the table. And then in September, we would report on the accomplishments and proposed recommendations. And the September meeting would be the goal. And then October meeting might be some cleanup and discussions of communication. So if you're all looking for a path to when will the task force role kind of be on its way to a recommendation, I believe that should be in September and possibly October at the latest. I think that if you keep dragging this out, you're going to start losing ground. So what have I done to come to these opinions? I've had individual meetings with every single, not every single one of you, but most of the members of the task force, either citizen members, MAR, and this was prior to the June meeting. I met with the mayor and the city staff, met with Chief Kitzmiller, MAR representatives. I met with citizen members and Civil Rights Commission members and had detailed discussions with them about their concerns and their approaches to try and get a feel for or take the temperature of this task force and what needs to be done so I can get to this point of feeling more confident in making recommendations, because I'm not a voting member. I don't make decisions. I'm just here to help guide the process. Meetings post-July meeting, I've had additional meetings. I met again with Chief Kitzmiller, and I met with the majority of his police force as a group to talk to them about policing and explore how their perspective on this matter. And I've reviewed all the resources that MAR submitted in advance of this meeting. I was familiar with many of them, but not all, and I reviewed them, reached out personally to Professor Barnum, who they'd recommended as a potential resource, to ask him to send me some of his unpublished studies. and asked them some questions and things like that. So I've done some research to show respect to everyone here for their concerns. The challenge of equitable policing is, as I presented the first time I ever talked to this group, defensiveness, polarization, a lack of knowledge and bias itself, and the overwhelming nature of the problem. That's what stops us. Everybody's defensive about policing. The police are defensive. Those who want the police to be equitable are defensive, and people all around the system are defensive. We always polarize the question of policing into either the camp of, is it racism or is it nothing at all? And that defensiveness and polarization barriers are a constant theme that exists in almost every single study, every single article, every single approach to equitable policing. And I believe one cannot make progress unless one realizes that, recognizes it, and takes steps to get around it. Professor Barnum, again, one of the resources provided by MAR, in his own way, in his own academic way, talks about the challenges of defining and isolating, the idea of traffic stop disparities. That using terms like profiling, stereotyping, discrimination, and racism are used interchangeably, or driving while black. It's this ambiguity of what we're really talking about, racism or not racism, is impeded theoretical progress, made it difficult to segregate and classify. What he means as an academic is, if there's the polarizing process and the way we label things actually makes it harder to make progress in analyzing data when it does come out. Professor Barnum, in his study, and it's useful to read it, he talks about different types of profiling. The idea that profiling is a very structured, intentionally discriminatory, policy-driven decision of a police department saying, we are going to profile African Americans or Hispanics or other groups because we think they're more likely to engage in crime. That's why that word particularly means something very specific. So to kind of like set the stage for this, on August 4th, I interviewed, I don't remember, Chief, if there were 20, but there was a full room of law enforcement personnel from dispatch, law enforcement officers in a room. The chief left the room and let me talk to them just one-on-one to kind of get their impression of what they thought about this thing. And I asked them some blunt questions. Do you have a profiling policy? And the answer was no. They have not learned that profiling is the policy before Chief Kitzmiller got here. Chief Kitzmiller has never told them that profiling is an acceptable process. They didn't learn secretly that there's a profiling method. I asked them if they learned from other people before. They just picked it up along the way. Did you learn about profiling certain neighborhoods? The answer is no. There's no official or unofficial policy of profiling of any group within this particular police department. They have had changes in policy because they're understaffed. They mainly respond to complaints now as opposed to being proactive. That's an important point. It may be more relevant for a later discussion, but I thought it was insignificant. There was concerns raised about the fact that sometimes the police are required to respond to, complaints from citizens that may in fact be biased. Hey, there's a black guy walking by my house. I think he looks dangerous. The police may have no choice but to show up, and it creates a problem in the sense that the African American may be saying, look, I'm just walking down the street here, and it may be from a citizen who's causing this type of response. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Polarization effect. I noticed this. It was clear that the officers feel that they're taking all the blame and that they feel that there's nothing they can do to make anyone realize that they're not all racist and they're not all just out looking to stop African Americans at every step of the way. And the perception that they're being labeled as racist. Again, that's very common in law enforcement. And it's just a perspective to keep in mind if we're trying to find a way to talk about equitable policing in an effective way. All law enforcement, including this one, needs expanded training on cultural respect and implicit bias. The chief is committed to that. The city's committed to that going forward. And I would remind all of you that I asked all of them, where were you trained to be police officers? And they all said at the Iowa Law Enforcement Academy, or for the most part, unless they came in from out of state. Only recently has Iowa been really focusing on implicit bias training for officers. And so they have a long way to go to get that training that, by the way, everyone needs, including lawyers. It's an important part of training that requires a lot of work in addition to what the other things they're trained to do. And of course, come up with an approach to work with officers to make them part of the solution. This is a common theme. Instead of talking at police and saying you're the problem, including them and getting them to embrace the change, can be important. And I believe Chief Kitzmiller, you have a fortunate person in his leadership who is ready to do that when not every law enforcement organization would be part of that process. Just for context, I reviewed again Professor Barnum's evaluation. He worked with the Iowa City Police Force. They collected data at a detailed level. He examined the data, and they've been doing it for a number of years. This is from I think this was from 2017 or 2019. There's still anything that's a blue bar compared to a red bar means that there's disproportionality in how African Americans are being stopped in that particular department. Now, Professor Barnum also identifies that there's challenges in the interpretation of disparity on race. Racial disparity and profiling takes on different meanings depending on who is using it, with at least 20 different definitions cataloged in literature. This is from when I put up these little cutouts here, these are cutouts from Professor Barnum's own studies. And I'm not being critical of him. He's a smart man, very committed. His data collection methods, I think, are potentially groundbreaking and helpful. But understanding the context of what are you going to do when you have data in the city? How are you going to interpret it is something to think about. And then disproportionality can indicate bias or discrimination, but it does not necessarily do so. In other words, there's always going to be ambiguity in whether or not the disproportionality data means that race is motivating it, and whether you want to interpret that as racism, as bias, as stereotyping, as structural policing, or any of the above. That's going to be the fundamental question that will always remain on the table. So that is my whirlwind tour of the foundations for considering equitable policing. And what I'd like to do be to go around the room just initially, even though this is not in any way precluding later discussion. There's a whole nother topic section on it for everyone to dig into everything that they want to talk about. But I wanted to kind of take the temperature of the room in terms of what is important to each one of you. What do you think about when you think about equitable policing? Just no pressure. If the answer is, I'm just listening, I don't really have a view on it right now, or I hear what you say, Mr. Newkirk, or whatever you want to say, or you have a very specific opinion, say so. Do you want to talk the data collection issue? Do you want to talk the challenges or limits on what the city can do or not do with regard to the policing issue? Do you want to talk about community perspective? In other words, regardless of what's happening in terms of data, what is the reputation? What do you want to talk about that? You want to talk about the training issues in terms of what's been done or what needs to be done? Anything at all, I would ask simply that, or talk about oversight, accountability, and the citizen review board idea. Key is everyone should go around the room, and it's just for, take, whether it's 30 seconds or 3 minutes, keep it limited because there's going to be other opportunities to go out into more detail. I'm sure Mara has a lot of information to discuss, and all of you may have 10-second opinions or 20-minute opinions, but let's keep it short for right now and just what do we think about when we think about equitable policing and what comes to mind as a major concern? That's what I'd like to do. And again, or anything that you think about in terms of general equitable policing. If it's okay, Mr. Brown, would you offer your thoughts first and just kind of go around the room? And again, no pressure to say more than what comes to your mind.
So as a member of the Civil Rights Commission and, thinking about it from the community perspective is probably the greatest priority from my standpoint. So I would like to definitely focus in on that topic.
Well, I think that what I'm looking at is more of a policy, a written policy that's concise and specific that the police department can operate under, and that the community is able to judge whether there are any situations that occur. And I think a lot of this will flush that out, in that they're able to play by the rules that are set, and they're also able to be held accountable to those rules that would be set. So I think the outcome is what I'm really actually looking for, is some kind of a policy that would allow them to go forward in partnership with the community.
I think my position would be that what got us to today has been fraught with a tragic history. I think our commitment right here and adjacent to us is strong. But most of what has been built to this moment has been misconception, lack of definitions, no data, and no steady learning model that goes with it that brings along populations, not just individuals. I think we sorely need whatever it is. Right now, we're talking about equity policing. I assume that's the same thing as, because other people would call it bias policing and then do the opposite definition and you just match them up, which is still confusing, okay? This work has already been done. It's been done in the state of Iowa. It's been done in Lynn County. And when I think about the porous nature of and the smallness of our community and how people move from place to place, my head is currently weighing that this should be a metro collaboration with uniqueness built from each agency that has a police department. Because if we're going to move forward collectively, we're going to need to build deep, organized, systematic, courageous conversations that spread deeply across the whole region. I don't know the difference between Cedar Rapids and Marion right up here on 7th Avenue when it turns into 1st Avenue. And so I think there's a way for us to collaborate. I think we can be a catalyst to that. I hope that we will start with some solid policy decisions, some policy recommendations, use of data. And when we get down into the co-create a training model, a learning development model, that we would create it with authentic learning experiences, not just sitting and watching PowerPoints and having meetings, that it actually involved in the field work where the people learning and the people on a citizens review board, which will be coming up later, would be deeply involved in that training as a requirement and move us forward.
Yeah, I think from where I sit, what I'm looking for is I want to come out of this with something that ensures that the officers in Marion are treating everybody the same. There's certain things we can and can't do as far as what laws we enforce. There's new state laws about what we have to enforce and can't ignore. But I think ultimately, I sleep better at night, or would sleep better at night, being assured that we're treating everybody the same. That's my ultimate goal, and that's the best I can do.
From my perspective, I want to ensure that our policies and our practices, particularly relative to hiring, promotions, discipline, we've got mechanisms in place to, again, ensure that everyone's being treated fairly and equally.
Yes, being new to the committee. Being new to the committee, I really want to listen and hear what the folks have to say. I'm trying to keep up with it, but honestly, the last week and a half. But regardless, obviously ensuring that we're as a city or treating everyone equal is clearly a priority.
Okay, so from my perspective, I want to know more about the training and bias training, since that's the world that I'm in right now as far as work. And then the accountability piece. You know, how are the officers going to hold each other accountable? Because that's a big thing for me. You know, if they're going to, you know, self-contain or account for each other and not let stuff slip under the rug, that's where a lot of it's going to go for me. So that's where I'm at right now.
I've identified 3 things that are highlights for me. The first one is the review and development and implementation of policies and practices that are looked at through a gender and a race lens, and then the intersectionality of gender and race together. I also think that the transparency of data and the steps that are taken is important, so that way the community does understand. And then the last thing actually has to do with one of the slides that you had just a little bit ago that talked about disproportionality and that it could be because of a car that's driven or how certain people. That's all code, and it's coded words because and I want to be able to address that and be able to say like, no, we're going to look at it up front. We look at the systemic issues that are surrounding a group of people, you know, whether that be based off of race or based off of gender or based off of age or based off of disability. But we don't say, oh, well, you know, there's more of a certain group that is having contact with the police because that's just, you know, because of a way that a group drives or something like that's just coded. And so being open, I think, is really important. And even if we're uncomfortable saying the words that are maybe a little yucky in my professional word.
That's great. I like it. Before I jump in, I want to make sure that we grab the mayor and Joshua's comments, and then I can circle back in. So Joshua,
Can you hear me?
we sure can.
Okay. Thank you. My particular thoughts on this is, one, I just wanted to make it clear that we never came to the place where we said everybody was racist. Not saying anybody did. I'm saying that to say that we're at a place where my thinking is that I want this policing. What it looks like to me is that everybody's given a fair chance, and that everybody is given an opportunity within any interaction with a police officer to at least have a fighting chance, without the thought of thinking, oh, they could be a criminal, or they could commit this act, or they seem like it's possible for them to commit that act. I just want them to. I would love it to look like that somebody can have an encounter with a police officer in a particular situation where they have an open mind when it comes to them having an engagement with them, whether it be white, black, any sexuality, any terminology. That's my belief on equitable policing.
Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you, Joshua.
Mayor, would you like to comment?
From my perspective, I think, you know, there's only one side to this. We're all on the same side. I know I've said that before. I want to see collaboration and cooperation from this group and across the city, people working together to solve these issues. I think this is a big process. I think the city, as Mr. Newkirk said, there are only so many things we can do. I would like to change everybody's heart and mindset. You know, but as a city organization, there are only so many things we can control. And I think that we all want the same result. We want our policies to lead people as a city organization to not have a different impact based on who the person is, and to treat everyone fairly and equally. And I think we can do that facts, data, and not based on perception or reputation, as others have called it. For city council to approve policies it has to be based on facts. So that's where I'm at. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Joshua, do you have your hand up? Okay, we'll move forward.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, I do. I raised my hand because I was gonna say, we online couldn't hear the mayor's remarks because he sounded scrambled.
Okay, let me just see what we can do. Hold tight. I'm talking, you get the same kind, just a moment ago, I think you had the same kind of feedback. He unmutes. Okay. So I don't know, Mayor, if you want to try to disconnect and reconnect, it seems like your connection is causing some feedback when you speak or when you're unmuted here and online for folks to hear you. Or dial in.
Yeah, I will try to reconnect. I'll try to reconnect. And if I have to do it simply by phone, I can do that too. And maybe you can just recap what I said for those who didn't hear it.
Yep. That sounds great. When you get back on, we'll bring you back.
Okay, but proceed without me, and I'll try to reconnect her. Thank you.
Okay, so now he's got a mute. Oh, there we go.
Proceed without him if you've been trying to get back on.
Thank you. Very good. Well,
not what I'm saying.
I'm glad we solved it, right? It took us a little while to figure that out. So very good. Thank you for that. So a couple of things, and I'm glad that I was able to come towards the end. So thank you, Mr. Newkirk, from going that direction, right? A couple of things. I think one, I would like to just pause and recognize, what we've done to get to this space. I think sometimes we feel like we've maybe been spinning our wheels and we haven't made progress, but this stuff takes time. And I think some of our conversations and discussions, although they've felt a little abstract, I really firmly believe it's brought us to this place where we can have these more deeper discussions. So I appreciate that. Secondly, in regards to your question about sort of checking in, what are our expectations, how are we feeling about this? I see a couple of things, as I think about my role. Okay, when he's muted, it seems okay. My role, right, on city council is we're really looking for the task force to bring forward some recommendations, and what we can and cannot do as city council is somewhat sort of constrained to policies and procedures and practices of the city. So I'm hopeful that we'll find a framework that will allow us to evaluate our current policies, practices, and procedures. And then that same framework we will be able to use to evaluate as we onboard new policies, practices, and procedures. And I think that will be really important. Secondly, I think it will be important for us to really start collecting the data. And I'm excited that we recently, City Council approved, I think it's $1.2 million for a system that will allow us to do that. So we have made a concerted effort to say, this is important to us. Let's get this software, because we recognize we've got a real deficit in the way in which we can collect and analyze that data. So, and then I think something that I would echo that I've heard through and through, and I really appreciate that about this group, is the desire just to make sure that everyone in the city of Marion is being treated equitably, right? So folks feel like they've all got a fair shake at living their best life in our community. And I would absolutely echo that and that importance of why we're doing this work. So I'll pass it on to you.
Just briefly, I'll just echo again. I think transparency of accountability and training and the data collection is fantastic. But I think if the community sees what training means and what training is actually being done, how is that defined? We say training. What's training? And the community says, big deal, you're training. What are the results of that training? And if you can show the results and you can see that people are being held accountable to that training, I think that's key. So transparency.
So I sent an email message around to members of the task force, but members in the community wouldn't have seen that. Just reiterating the position of the Marion Alliance for Racial Equity. We are interested in eliminating disproportionality in traffic stops as a way into this broader conversation about equitable policing, creating a citizen review board, and we'll talk more about kind of the substance of that. And then also changing the policies, practices, and professional learning opportunities among all city staff, which includes policing and fire, but also folks right here, really all city staff, to ensure that we are able to overcome the kinds of systemic challenges that we face across the nation. And finally, to have mental health liaisons as a long-term component of how we engage in policing in Marion. So we are on the way on a lot of things. I think it's actually quite possible we're not too far off from what Chief Kitzmiller wants, what the city staff want. What we've been indicating is that the problem is we haven't had that conversation. And so we don't know. We don't actually know. Like you might say today, all of you around the table, oh, all those points in the citizen review board, you bet, let's do that. Let's make that recommendation tomorrow. Kind of doubt it, but we just haven't had that conversation. So that I'm very much looking forward to having that kind of a conversation. The stuff that you shared earlier, you can share that it's great and it's done, but we've never ever seen that. Like we never saw more than half of what you shared. And so that's great. Now, if we can get that and we can kind of dig into it and look at it, then that we may be able to say, you know what, yeah, you're right. That training actually is deep and substantive in the way we actually think that it ought to be. We just don't know because we haven't heard it yet. So that's what I'm especially looking forward to seeing. I will say that early discussions suggested we don't agree on the problem. And so that's part of the work is making sure we understand there's a sense, it's a difficult thing in the United States today to acknowledge that you have a problem related to race and ethnicity. And it has been difficult for this task force. I don't feel like we've come to an agreement on the fact that we have issues here. And we can talk a little bit about why and what the evidence is that makes it feel like we don't have an agreement, and that might be really fruitful. But it's hard to come up with solutions to a problem you don't agree exists. And so that's part of what we've been, I think, trying to do, and it takes time. I absolutely agree that that takes time. I'm hoping that as we move into the specific conversations about the policies and the practices, it will help to similarly surface these questions about, is this actually resolving a problem we can agree on or not? We've never claimed that everyone is racist. And as a matter of fact, I personally don't use the term racist. So the idea that we are intentionally making it polarizing and saying that it's either everyone's racist or nothing, it's hard to not take offense to that, quite frankly, because that's not been our position. And our position has been, we want to have these conversations. We want to talk to police officers and the chief and city staff and others. We actually believe that it very much is rooted in implicit bias. It is rooted in historic narratives that are 400 years old, that we all enact and reenact, that we at the Marion Alliance enact and reenact, and are constantly trying to figure out our own piece of the mess. And we're in it together. And I feel like certainly the mayor, what I could hear is he was, we're in this together, and we do agree with that and are excited to be at the table if the table is going to contain it. If not, that's part of why we wanted a structural change like a citizen review board, because there are people at this table that want this table to be done in a month or two. We're not going to have solved any of the issues on the table in a month or two. Maybe we can create a body that will. Oh, that would be fabulous. Maybe not, and maybe we need to figure out whether we're willing as a community to actually tackle these issues. So that's sort of the interest that we bring, is that we as a community want to acknowledge, maybe we don't have all the data, but there's not much that would suggest we're immune to the kinds of challenges and problems that we shared in the materials that we've talked about as we've been coming to this place. So we can get caught up in definitions and details, and I think that's fine, but we also have to step back and recognize we have disproportionality. People of color experience Marion different than white people. We have to acknowledge that and take responsibility for it and work together to change the conditions that are creating those kinds of disproportionate experiences and disproportionate outcomes. And I think we can do it. I mean, I truly believe we can do it, and we can do it together. So thank you, glad to be here.
I think as a city, we want to make sure we're doing everything we can to treat everyone the same. And at the same time, we want to be fair to everyone, whether that is intentional or unintentional. So we'll be cognizant of the unintended consequences of our policies and practices.
Okay. Okay. Just so we're clear, my reference to the either or way that we polarize things has literally nothing to do with Mar or your position. It has to do with the position of how everyone in society evaluates this issue. It's always through the polarized lens. It is important for those who to say it's not only about racism, it's about bias. And it's like, and I always do the training as well. There are some racist cops, there are some racist lawyers, there are racist doctors, but the vast majority of the issue, of course, is implicit bias driven. It's important to depolarize the issue as the primary point. And I think the police are ready to have that happen as well. That's why I recommend using equitable policing instead of profiling, because it creates that defensive response in the group you'd like to help with. Citizen review, there aren't events or data to justify a citizen review board in this city particularly that I've heard about. There's been no shootings, no physical abuse issues. There's a reputation and there's evidence of, and then the idea of bias policing that can extend to this community like it is in Iowa City. That's possible as well. And there's not very little evidence that citizen review actually works to change policing. There's 150 of them around the country, I think, we're counting. And in my view, as an advocate for African Americans for my entire career, it distracts from the actual issues that can help us solve and get to the problem of what the chief said, what you indicated, what everyone says. We just want people to get through this city and be treated in the same way, regardless of whether they're skin color or the race or gender, in terms of being stopped and addressed by the police. That's the goal. And there's a better version available than a citizen review board. It's called micro level accountability, and you're about to have it. The micro level data collection and accountability and evaluation of data, no one's actually had that before. The idea that a police officer is now going to be held accountable, not only by his body cam footage at any moment, but by the fact that at a micro level, we can pinpoint where he's doing, who he's doing it to, how he's doing it. And if you don't think that's going to create accountability in those officers, that is far beyond any citizen review board, it's the data collection has always been the key. And it's going to create a level of accountability that can actually maybe change behavior within policing that people are concerned about. And I think you need to ensure that the public is aware of the ability to review body cams. The chief has offered to say anytime a citizen has an issue with an officer for being rude, abusive, profiling, etc., you can go watch the body cam footage of that event with that officer with the chief right there. And again, if you can then tie that beginning next year or as soon as the data collection's in availability to the data collection about that officer. And that's what you'll be able to do. And one thing that Professor Barnum's study showed was that you can, even in Iowa City where he did this data collection, there was disproportionality. He did it by officer and by group. And there were some officers and groups that did not have disproportionality, but there were some that did. And that's what you want to be able to do, is to identify issues within the law enforcement that are not necessarily everyone's got the same problem. And again, I think that what I'm hoping to do is resonate with all of you that you need to make partners of the police in this process, not blame and shame, and ensure increased training. And by training, what I mean is I've been somewhat retained to kind of develop the training. I've worked for 20 years to think about training that actually works. It's not surface level training, it's in-depth training to deal with as much as social science permits, to reduce the effects of implicit bias. And let me just tell you, I brought a study with me, the only study I've ever seen where they spent several $1 million. They spent hours, weeks and weeks and months training and retraining the officers and doing analysis. And this was in New York, and it didn't change the data. The reason why the inventor of the implicit dissociation test recommends me for training is because I know that right now the social science doesn't support that training alone works. And I don't say it does. You have to have what I believe is a much more micro level source of accountability that can alter the behavior within the mind of someone who may be an officer or a lawyer or anybody else out making decisions about persons of color. You have to have that. That's the only way you can fight it. And you have to have methods of speaking to that group and training that group that opens them up to the idea of self-awareness, doesn't make them resistant to it. And that's kind of what I do. So that's a little bit more on the training issue where I would suggest it go. And, you know, again, making the police accountable, but not talking down to them. There's going to be a high level of internal accountability that's going to take place when the data collection comes with the body cam footage. And all you got to do is put it in place and analyze it. And it can be best of the best in the country. And that's what you should be working on. Last thing, IKEA bias is my favorite bias. We like things when we work together to put them together. We like the result better when we're part of putting it together. And I think that's what all of you need to understand is that it's not like there's some magic pill of training, some magic pill of this. It's going to be an ongoing process to tie the training to data collection, to then respond to the data collection, to then change potentially training and approaches to see how it works. And you all won't know that with any degree of certainty until the data collection comes. I think that's going to be sometime next year. So that's my final thought on that. And now I would recommend, last thing, to the councilwoman, that I know the next section was about the civil service stuff. And I was hoping we could keep that somewhat limited only because we need to get back to this discussion, make sure we have plenty of time to get right back into it and maybe even reverse it. But again, that's just my suggestion to you to make sure there's plenty of time to talk about it.
So I think it is important for us to have that discussion. However, I think the civil service information will inform that discussion as well, because part of what we'll learn through that will, I think, impact where we see what we can and cannot do based on what we have access to. So I do like the recommendation of moving through that. I don't want to say as quickly as we can, right, to skip things, but to move so we can get back to the conversation that we're here to have, this idea of equitable policing in reflection to what Mr. Newkirk has presented, and then what we learn about the civil service and union rules. So who will be doing that piece for us this evening?
Holly Corkery with Lynch Dallas is with us here today. She's going to be giving us an overview of chapter 400 in relation to hiring and retention.
Perfect. Thank you, Holly.
Thank you all for inviting me tonight. I've really enjoyed listening to your discussion. I live in Marion, so this is important. It's been really informative to me. My name is Holly Corkery. I work at Lynch Dallas Law Firm in Cedar Rapids. I'm a labor and employment lawyer. I will try to be as brief as possible, but I'm a lawyer again, so we talk, but I will be brief. So I'm going to talk about civil service, and then I did tack on a couple other laws that I think you all should be aware of when you're making this, that are part of hiring, promotions, and discipline issues. So the Iowa Code governs civil service laws. Also, if you have questions throughout this, just please interrupt me. It's going to be easier to deal with it then than to wait till the end and I won't remember what we were talking about. But Iowa Code Chapter 400 governs civil service laws in Iowa. And that puts certain guidelines in place about how cities of a certain size can hire, promote, and discipline employees. Marion, the size issue is based on the 1980 census, so that likely needs to be updated. But Marion met that threshold in 1980, so we are a civil service community. We have a civil service commission that governs the process. They've adopted their own set of rules, and they work through those processes as we're going to talk about. So with respect to hiring, employees hired under civil service, which the code says that all appointed employees and police and fire are civil service employees. So for this discussion, I think police is really what we're talking about here. So police employees are hired under civil service and they have to take an entrance exam. The exams are crafted for the purpose of making sure that they have the qualifications to do the job. The intent of a civil service exam is to be fair, right? And to eliminate biases and, doing favors for others or hiring certain people's kids or things like that. The law says the exam has to be practical and it has to relate to matters which will fairly test the mental and physical ability of the applicant to do the job. The commission establishes the guidelines for the exam. The law specifically says that the applicants can't be discriminated against on the basis of their height, weight, sex, or race in determining the physical and mental ability of the applicant. Separate of that, the Iowa Civil Rights Act lists all the protected classes we think of when we think of protected class issues, but those would not include height and weight. So those are still protected classes and we're not ignoring those in this hiring process. New to the law this year, the commission is required to hire a person with expertise to prepare and administer the exam, and then the exam's approved by the commission. After the examinations, the commission certifies a list of up to 40 individuals to the city council. Those 40 applicants have to be the ones with the highest standing as a result of the examination for the positions they seek to fill. If there are less than 40 qualified applicants, then all of them go on the list and they're put in the order of standing based on the examination. They aren't necessarily hired off in that order. They can be hired off in any order once they're on that list. So if there was an interview process and that's where we can get those sort of, the interviews and the fit and all that can be put into there. So there are policies that could be put in place with respect to that. But you have to be on the list to be hired. Promotions are also determined by examination. It's a very similar system, except there's only 10 applicants per position, and that list stays active for 2 years or until the list is exhausted. So very similar, but once you have your list, you are stuck with that list for 2 years. And in a city of Marion size, we're not filling that many sergeant roles and we're not filling that many lieutenant roles, so you very well could have that list for that long. In terms of discipline on the back end of employment, civil service employees cannot be removed, discharged, demoted, or suspended arbitrarily. That's the language from the law. And I can give you some examples of where things were arbitrary. One example in the case law where something was arbitrary was where an employee complained about sexual harassment and then was terminated. And the court thankfully said that that was arbitrary. There's another example where an employee was accused of theft and was later exonerated of that theft, but still terminated. That was found to be arbitrary. Arbitrary is, kind of an ambiguous term, and there's a lot of different ways that can be interpreted. But that's the standard we have. And then the law goes on to tell us that if they're going to be terminated, suspended or demoted, it must be essentially for a policy violation. There's a lot of language here from the statute, but it's a policy violation or a legal, you violated the law. That's where that's going to be, okay? Or that in the judgment of this individual sitting right here, the chief of police, this person's not suitable or not fit for employment anymore. So that's how the law would essentially define arbitrary, I guess, in terms of the statute. But that's still pretty broad, right? That's a lot of different things that you could have that discipline for. So this process is a long process on the back end. If you discipline an employee, they have an appeal process they can go through. The first appeal is to the Civil Service Commission, and that is essentially a trial in front of the Civil Service Commission. There's evidence put on, there's a court reporter, witnesses. It's a long process. The second appeal is to the Lynn County District Court because of where we sit jurisdictionally. And then the third appeal would be to the Iowa Supreme Court, and they could retain it or they could route it to the Iowa Court of Appeals. Any questions about civil service? Yes.
Those particular cases of how do the finances work in terms of spending the, how's that funded?
So the terminated employee or the disciplined,
Who's paying for what costs for
the city's not paying, the city is not required to pay for that. And I'm not aware of any instance where a city has paid for that. The city will pay for their own legal costs in putting up their case. But that would be private pay from the employee, different, whether the employee's paying it personally, whether their union's paying for it, whether they have some sort of insurance that's paying it. That is different everywhere and in every situation. And yep. Any other questions? I'm just going to touch on a few other laws so you all are aware. Iowa does have a veterans preference in hiring. So if you have two applicants that have the same qualifications and one's a veteran, you have to hire the veteran under the law. And there's an appeal process there. So I just want you all to be aware of that. Your police department and your fire department and your public services department have unions. So you need to just be aware of that there are certain contractual restraints that the city has with respect to the police union. Chapter 20 is the bargaining statute in the state of Iowa, and it has certain topics that are mandatory for cities to talk about with unions when they sit down to bargain. Examples of that we don't think of always: drug testing is a mandatory topic under health and safety, hiring bonuses, something you think of that an employer could just do, but that's a mandatory topic that you have to talk about with them before you can do that. So certain topics have to be discussed with those unions, and the chief's very aware of those. But failure to do that can end up in a prohibited practice complaint with the Iowa Public Employee Relations Board or a grievance of the contract, both of which can be expensive for the city to defend. In terms of discipline, all employees have to get due process before they're disciplined. They have to be given an opportunity to give their side of the story, essentially. So there's a federal case that requires that. And what that means really for cities and government employees in general is that we can't just fire them, just say you're fired because we think you did this. We have to give them that opportunity to share their side and evaluate that and give that some thought before we take any disciplinary action. There is a peace officer bill of rights in Iowa. Tom, have you guys talked about that at all? That doesn't have much impact on hiring. It does have some impact on discipline and just making sure you go through certain processes, but I don't know that it would have much impact on what you all are doing here from what I've gathered. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on Iowa's open records law. The law for personnel records, have you talked about this at all, Tom? So for personnel records in the state of Iowa for government employees, cities can only share certain information. Those records are confidential records under the law. You can share wages and benefits, those things. You can share the colleges and universities they went to. You can share their previous employer. But for your purposes, and what I think is important to note for you all, you can't share their discipline and things like that have occurred. So if they get wrote up, we can't share that as a government entity. The only time we can share that is we can share the fact that the individual resigned in lieu of termination, was discharged or demoted as the result of a disciplinary action, and the documented reasons and rationale for that resignation in lieu of termination, discharge, or demotion. So that's the Iowa code, and there's not a lot that cities can do about that barrier, unfortunately, in terms of sharing that. Yeah.
Question for you. So does the city have the power to create a board that could override these state laws?
No, not that I'm aware of.
And they couldn't create a board that says, hey, we're gonna just give the citizens a copy of this police officer's discipline because we want to. They can't do that.
No.
Thank
A city could never do that without being exposed to a lot of liability for violating that individual's privacy and violating the law essentially. At least that would be my thought. So that is all I have for you all, but I'm happy to, I know you wanted me to be brief, so I tried to be as brief as possible. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yeah.
Laura, the idea in a practical world, that's the only reason.
When another lawyer is asking me, I feel like I'm like, is this law school? Did I get this wrong, actually?
You're the expert on this, not me. So just as a practical example, let's say that there's a complaint about a police officer that, maybe the chief thinks that, this guy's got a problem with, he treated this woman really badly. It's really something I want to seriously discipline him for, or maybe even terminate him for. To what extent can he talk about that in the public, number one? And number two, if that officer wants to fight it to the death, what can that officer do in the real world to drag it out, and how will that work? What you've just gone over, just real practically.
So practically that could, that's a spider web that can go a lot of different ways. If the chief, just raises this to him and says, I want to have a discussion about this, and he says, I'm resigning, there's really nothing we can ever talk about because he's voluntarily resigned. It wasn't in lieu of termination. I suppose if there was body camera video of the event, that would be a public record, but his disciplinary file would not be a public record. So there's not a lot there. If you sit down and have the discussion with him and ultimately decide that he needs to be let go, or you need to sever that employment relationship, he can appeal through most likely he'll appeal through civil service. If he's a veteran, he could appeal that way. And there are other ways, I suppose, but most likely he'll appeal through civil service. And those hearings are supposed to take place in 30 days. Most parties waive that because, since you probably can imagine, Tom, when you do trials, it's hard to put a trial together in 30 days. So a lot of times they won't happen for 6 months or so. And then I had a civil service appeal from 2019 where the hearing was held in 2019, and the Court of Appeals hearing on that just came down in the past month. So that is a long process in terms of that, if you want to fight to the death.
Are there other questions for Holly on what she presented before we get into the next discussion? Go ahead.
I have a question, and I think the last couple of questions are inclined to thinking about a citizens review board, but it's generally what goes to that board, if from all the 150 or so that are out in the country, is a recommendation from the police chief, not so much the disciplinary file of that individual, that seeing whether or not he is, the decision is something that's agreed to and passed on, and not necessarily, here's his file, why don't you go ahead and review it? I think that the Citizens Review Board is either supporting or doubting what the chief has come to a conclusion, and not necessarily the disciplinary file of the individual.
So I'm not an expert in citizen review boards. So if it was a decision about an internal affairs investigation done, whether that was substantiated or not, that's generally going to be a confidential personnel record. So that you could not share that under Iowa law. If it's a decision about what to do with this individual's employment, that you could potentially share that, just depending on how that shook out and whether it was the right kind of decision, a demotion, resignation in lieu, whatever. Then you could potentially share that if it fell under those parameters of Chapter 22. Does that make sense or not?
Yeah, that does, but I think it's more of a citizen complaint about how they were treated at the review board as far as misconduct from an officer. And the chief has decided this is how he's interpreted it, and he is recommending discipline. And some citizen review board may say that you didn't go far enough. That's the thing, the point that's being challenged, not necessarily what the individual did or his disciplinary file, but based on the recommendation of the police chief. They have that latitude at that point. And they're not opening up anything and violating any procedures or laws or anything. They're just judging and evaluating the police chief's recommendation.
Are citizen review boards public meetings? You'd want to comply with chapter 21, and if the officer wanted to have that in closed session, then you'd have to have it in closed session. But you're gonna have to be careful and think the parameters around this to make sure you're not providing any confidential personnel records.
I agree. The procedures that have to be set up and established in order for that to operate. Yes, thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments about?
Just briefly, it seems there's a balance between the rights of the person with the infraction, the rights of the person who was assaulted, so to speak, or the person who was the victim. And there's also the rights of the public who want to know what happened, what the details are. And so you have all these policies and state laws that prohibit transparency. And so here we are, you were supposed to be accountable as a task force to say, this is what we're doing, but immediately I'm hearing, here are your roadblocks. So, and no, don't take it, don't internalize this, Holly. I'm just saying.
Well, I just want to clarify one point to make sure.
Yeah, no, and I'm just saying there's got to be a balance, and maybe there's some bullet points that the task force can say, community, here are the things that we can say, and here are the things that were done as a result of this, and here's the best we can do accountability wise, transparency wise, and then so on and so forth. But go ahead.
So I just want to be clear, and is Kara Bullerman still on? So if Kara wants to opine on this.
I am here, Holly.
Okay, peace officer investigative records. So if there would be an event and the board would want to look into that, those investigative records, separate of the discipline, those are public records subject to a balancing test and all sorts of things under the law. But generally there would be a way to work that out. And Kara, you can opine on that more if you'd like, but I just want to be clear that although that is not necessarily the clearest path, it's easier than the disciplinary record issue.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Holly. Sorry, I just figured I would chime in at this point in time. I would agree that it would have to be examined on a case-by-case basis, because there are times, and under the law, they are able to keep a lot of those reports confidential depending on what's happening with the investigation. And so there may be times where you would not be able to access those records. But the other thing is that there would be a potential, depending on what the Board or Commission was doing, it would be an open meeting, a meeting of of a citizen review board if it is affiliated with the city, which I assume if they want to be able to make and influence policy, they'd want to be appointed or created by city council to serve in their official role. So they would need to follow those rules for open meetings. But there would potentially be some room for a closed session if that came up. But again, that would need to be on a case-by-case basis. And then there would have to be really clear parameters about what could or couldn't be released from that meeting as well.
Thanks, Kara. Anything else based on Holly's presentation, information she shared before we jump into the next? Okay, that was helpful. Thank you, Holly. And you did move through it quickly as a lawyer. Impressed.
I'm going to make sure that everyone knows that at work.
Right. It's recorded, so send it their way. Next, we're going to have some discussion now based on what Mr. Newkirk has shared with us, what Holly has shared with us, opportunity to provide voice for everyone. So I'm going to do my best to make sure that I can call on you. The goal will be to try to hear everybody that wants to speak first and then circle back around, right? If we've got folks that have some additional comments. So that's how we're going to work through this next part of the agenda, which is where we're going to jump right into the perspectives on equitable policing and kind of what we're thinking at this point. So With that, who would like to start this evening? Thank you. Carlo, is it Carlos, right?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so. I'll go off your point here. As we talked about the accountability and, you know, training. As I sat here and listened to Holly and then listened to Kara, and then I started to think historically. I'm a big history buff, not like some, but I started to think about how the laws were created and who they were created for, even from a lawyer standpoint. They weren't created equally for people of color. They were created for people who are non-color. If you really sit and think about that. So just marinate on that for a bit. They weren't created for people of color. It was to make sure that they were treated unfairly. Marinate again. So that's where I was listening to all the talk and listening to your presentation and started to think like, okay, we were already set up to fail 400 years ago, period. So now we're trying to backtrack and retroactively make it better. It's not going to happen unless you retroactively go back and start digging into these laws. All this lawyer talk, all of these, you know, you can say systemic, but it's well past systemic. It's the law itself. That's where I'm at.
Thank you for that, Carlos. Let me ask a clarifying question. I'd been thinking about this, so I'm glad you brought that up because now it's going to force me to ask a question I should have to begin with. Holly, the codes and the laws that you were sharing with us today, commission, all of that, if there's a change that we want to make to those, right? So based on, as I'm listening to Carlos, and I completely agree with your comment, Carlos, the process for that is what, right? I mean, that's talking to our legislators. Is that talking to, can you help us just walk through that process a little bit? Because I feel like that's a little intertwined with what we're doing this evening as well.
So, yep, everything that I think everything I talked about except due process is a state law, and that would be talking to your local representatives, your senator. I don't know if the city utilizes a lobbyist. You may. Some cities utilize a lobbyist though that goes and you may do one jointly that goes and lobbies, you know, for certain changes or things that would benefit the city. So that would be something that you could look at or connect with that person if you do, obviously. But that would be where to start. It has to be in Des Moines at the State House.
Okay, that was helpful. That was my assumption, but I've learned that assumptions aren't always accurate. So thank you for that. Go ahead, please.
So my experience in trying to change Iowa code is I've been working on one code specifically for 20 years and it still hasn't changed. So I know that it is a awful process. But I agree with you, Carlos, that exactly what you were saying, that the system itself was developed to create an imbalance and to reinforce an imbalance and maintain it. And so what I would like to see from the recommendations or the steps moving forward is, what is the plan to be able to start our decades long process to help change Iowa code, you know, step outside of Marion. I think that has to be part of this discussion is what can we change within, but then also we have some responsibility outside of Marion. And how do we have a voice at the state level? How do we find out, you know, like start to build that momentum? Because maybe it will take less than decades, but.
Can I just,
sure, please.
I thought of another option you all would have. The Public Employee Relations Board, or no, excuse me, the Iowa Public Information Board is the board that governs they govern complaints related to open meetings laws and open records laws. They also have a lobbying component. So I think, whether this group goes to one of those meetings, I've been to several of those meetings, and you can go speak in open discussion, whether you partner with their chair, Margaret, or their executive director, Margaret Johnson. But that group, I think, might be able to help you, because those laws seem to be the laws that are creating the barriers from what I'm hearing. So just a thought.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Yes. It would be helpful to know what we're talking. I don't know any proposal that's on the table that would require a change to state code. So I don't exactly know what we're worried about. So that's it's just out there. You can, if we want to go there, go there. If there's nothing, what I end up hearing is we can do what we want. It might require a change to state code, in which case we turn our attention to state code. At the moment, I don't think there's anything on the table that state code is prohibiting us to do. So
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I don't know for sure. If we were to talk about history, we have to be a little bit more narrow than what your perspective is. It's affluent white male that the laws were generated for. Women and people of color and Native Americans were not considered in that part. So it's a vast, bigger picture than that. The other thing is that there isn't anything code-wise that we need to be concerned with, because the cities, the jurisdictions have the ability underneath their own operation to develop policies and procedures that would be able to be addressed to this, and probably not being as clear. But the city of Des Moines put out a unbiased policing document that talks about the policy statement, gives definitions, procedures, and training. And this is what they've been operating since 2017. So you can operate within the framework and develop something that would be a structure that would allow the city to comply and achieve the objectives that we're trying to do as a task force. To climb that hill that you're talking about, changing code, is going to mean that this task force would have to be around a lot longer than what many of us would like to be. And I agree with you, Jennifer, that does take time. And I think we need to address things now with whether we looked at the city of Des Moines and their unbiased policing. I think that would be a possibility, and develop something like that. Give the chief a framework that he can operate in, that the city can get behind, and then allow him to hold his police force accountable based on that structure and whatever it is that they come up with. And I think that's what we have to do today or tomorrow or some point. We have to set up a policy and procedure, and specifically what Tom was talking about. I think I made that comment, the new way, micro level accountability, that we have to start chewing on something like that, structure this thing so we can move forward and eventually get off this train that we're heading to, I don't know where, but we need to come out with something so the community knows that we have set the task, we've defined what the objective is, and we've reached a conclusion. And until we do that, we're going to have these discussions and keep going back and forth.
Thank you. Al, did you have something?
Shortly then. So if we're going to go to the deep past and that kind of thing and unpack it, probably the thing I would ask is, does the city council or the city of Marion have a legislative agenda that they're working on with the Association of Cities in the state, and form the coalition to go that way? And that may be something that we would want to consider in our recommendation package for that long-term digging deep into the past. But I would concur a better starting point for our purview would be what Steve just mentioned.
Thank you. Yes.
Seriously, would you be willing to kind of lay out what the board of review is from your perspective in the real world, and just some kind of, I think that we're kind of talking around the issue of, we don't need legislative stuff for this or that, but kind of like, what is the board of review? What does it envision? What it's supposed to do? What is it? What is its purpose? And just kind of give us a little overview on that would be helpful, I think.
Sure, yeah. So in many ways, it's the body that's doing the sorts of things we've been talking about right here, particularly if you think this task force is going to be disbanded. This task force doesn't have any teeth. The Citizen Review Board is the body that would. It's the body that would stay long-term to hold the system accountable to doing the kinds of long-term system change that were required and the short-term immediate steps that have to be taken. And it would be a Citizen Review Board. So it would be comprised of citizens of Marion. Many CRBs, Citizen Review Boards, are centered on responding to complaints. And I think that we believe that would be a role of this board, but we actually believe that that should not be the central role because that's putting incredible burden on individuals who have been harmed, who also may be harmed in the process of filing a complaint. And so instead, this board should really have as its primary responsibility looking at data, looking at policies and procedures, finding out about outcomes and how people are experiencing Marion in order to make sure that the kinds of changes we're talking about get us to the kind of outcome that Chief Kitzmiller wants, which is that everyone is treated equitably. Is that too high level for what you were asking?
Well, I guess I wanted to get to the heart of it, which is that in your citizen review design specifications, I saw some of your documents, you know, the idea that the board would independently investigate officer misconduct in reviewing whatever that happens to be and provide, you know, proactively initiate research investigations. I wanted to see if, would that be done separately outside? I mean, how would that relate to the laws that prohibit, you know, being involved in the discipline of the officers specifically, or knowing what's going on with the officer with regard to what the chief knows? So there were, if the complaint comes to the Citizen Review Board and they want to investigate, you know, and they can't really do anything about it, or can they?
That would be part of what we would need to be talking about, is what kind of teeth would we want to give to the review board. I think the key thing we need to make sure is that citizens have someone to go to who they trust will actually listen to their concerns and take it to the full extent of what could be done. Go ahead.
So my clarifying question, well, a clarifying question that I have is, how is that different than like the Civil Rights Commission that we already have in Marion? And when it comes to if there is a complaint, and or are you saying that a citizen review board is only for police issues, or is it also for other city issues?
It's only for policing. Yep. And Amal might be able to talk to some of how the authority of the Civil Rights Commission for some of these kinds of things is, it actually wouldn't have the authority to do some of what, but I don't know, you've talked about that before.
Yeah, but I think it's kind of like the same purpose and same mission that the Civil Rights Commission has and role in terms of being engaged in long-term policies and enforcing city ordinance, making sure everybody's treated the same. The focus right now is on the Civil Rights Act, which is protected classes. And I think we're talking here about a protected class as well.
Okay.
I want to ask one question. What is the problem we're trying to solve here? We're talking about Marion community. Can we step back and look what is the issue? Because a citizen review board is a solution. What is the problem, and how do we know?
It's a good question. Do we have some folks that would like to speak to that from your perspective, based on what we have learned, right, up to this point? Comments?
I think,
Go ahead.
listening to Cersei, I think I guess my question is, what would a civilian review board do, or what do you envision that doing that the city council can't do? Because I've worked this week with 2 city councilmen in the first 3 days of this week on citizen complaints that they go directly to the council. And then it's brought to my attention, and then they're following up with what I'm doing with it. So I guess I don't know what, I mean, they're accountable to the people that elect them. And I think they've got some teeth, at least with police department and budgets and things like that. When you talk about something with teeth, is there something different that a civilian review board or citizen review board would do that the council wouldn't or can't?
I think in many ways, it's a similar kind of deepening of my response to, is it just about policing? It's really, it is about what are some of the biggest challenges that we face and what kind of specialization do we need to make sure we can address those? City council has a lot of work on their agenda. A lot of decisions are made, millions and millions, probably billions, I don't even know, millions of dollars are being spent. This is about making sure we make sure that we have a body in Marion that helps us engage in the kinds of long-term change we have to engage in, because we have people of color in Marion and who come through Marion who experience policing differently than white people. And we hear it and we know it. The little bit of data we've seen has shown disproportionality. I'm all about, we got to dig into the data differently and understand it and pull it apart. No matter where I've seen that done, there's always been disproportionality, sometimes dramatic, sometimes not so dramatic, but people of color just being stopped twice as often as white people, to me, is dramatic. We're at more than that. Iowa City is at more than that. So it's dramatic. People are experiencing policing differently here. It's our responsibility to figure out what to do about it. And that, in our understanding, is about long-term systems change, because this is a 400-year-old problem, a system that was designed to do one thing that should be doing something very different. So the idea of a citizen review board is, let's get a body together to figure out what's happening here and how we can make those changes across the entire system. It's about policing because that's such a significant and in some cases life and death kind of experience that a community controls how we manage. It's also about schools. It's also about the public facing parts of city council. It's about all of us. It's about our businesses. It's about our community. Policing is one place that everyone involved, it's high stakes. And so the importance of having a board that says our job is to make sure we're doing everything we can to get the vision that Chief Kitzmiller put forward, that we're all treated equitably. That takes specialization. It takes work. It takes time to do. To look into people's complaints takes time. That's not something that I want the city council. I don't think that our city council has the time to do that level of specialized investigations, and the investigations of complaints, as I said, is only a piece of it. The more important thing is what is the proactive work? What is the training? What does it look like? How do we know? What are the impacts of it? What is this long-term vision that we have, and how are we making sure things are happening? Because all too often, our systems don't do the kinds of things over the kind of time that we need to see change. Systems change takes 10 years. Al, you can talk more about that kind of stuff.
I don't want to talk about that. What I'd like to ask though, is I read over the design specifications for a citizen review board that MAR has proposed. And then I also examined the Cedar Rapids Citizen Review Board. And I noticed some similarities, same eye on the ball, but different approaches. As I said earlier, we live in an area where people are going in and out of Marion, Cedar Rapids all the time. And we have the character of a citizen review board, one that in Cedar Rapids is sufficiently independent for defined purposes. And then MAR has one that has a different set of purposes that really has a different relationship with the police chief and the department. And in a metro area, to have coherence in what I would call allness, no exclusion, we need our whole community population that interfaces with itself all the time be on the same page and unite and dig down and eliminate these historic problems. So my question, I guess, is why would we have separate, distinct authorities for the same thing in the same neighborhood and be split at the outset for what we want unity to be around? And so I think this is a unifying dimension that we should be working on. And that's the piece. So when I see in here independently, sufficiently independent in the Cedar Rapids approved board, and this one, I see that, you know, it has the authority to hire and fire the police chief. Well, that is not in Cedar Rapids, but it is here. How do these things, how could we make them coherent? And I'm honoring the work. And I know that there's going to be a lot more tough discussions that are going to need to occur, but I think we need to be coherent to make sense to the community writ large.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
And I don't want to, you know, I've sat on some boards, but not to any great detail. And I would simply say, and I'm not going to belabor the issue, but we talk about 400 years of oppression and suppressing laws and that kind of thing. And okay, it may not be about changing the law, but it is. And so if one city has the power to address police chiefs, and don't, you know, here I am saying don't internalize again, but you know, if there's laws that address certain activities in one area, then those laws can also happen. And if they work in that area, then they should be looked at for, you know, reviewed, and maybe there's an opportunity to put some of those working laws, or at least allow the public to say, this is not working, or I keep banging my head against this for 20 years. I've been trying to make this change and it doesn't change. And so if as a community and this task force comes together and says, we got a great idea, let's put it into action. Chief, go for it. And chief goes for it. He finds 5 officers that are habitually doing X, Y, and Z. And the next thing you know, those 5 officers are still policing 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, because there's no teeth in what we've been given an opportunity to do. And is that teeth because of the law? Is that teeth because we didn't come up with proper policy to fix it? I don't know. But I agree. We shouldn't be in here talking about immediately changing laws. But in the end, it's going to come down to someone not being able to get past some law, and maybe a brilliant attorney that says, oh, you overlooked this. He's going to keep policing for another 20 years. I don't, you know, it's a real gray, nebulous thing. But to me, I think there is some law involved in it. Just had to get that off my.
It's perfect. That's why we're here. I'll get you in just a second, Mr. Newkirk. I have a question, and it's maybe a little related to Amal's, but as I'm thinking about us agreeing or not agreeing, right? That we have some opportunities to make some change within our police department. Is the citizen review board the only option, right? So I'm thinking from a city council, right? I got my city council hat on. I'm trying to keep that on. And thinking about, okay, if we recognize that there's some opportunity for our police department to do even better work, and we think that one way in which they can do that is through a citizen review board. Another way, which I think is somewhat intertwined perhaps with the citizen review board, but was this micro level accountability. I see that could be either completely separate or it could be a part of, right, a citizen review board. What I'd be curious to know is, what are other ways that this kind of work could be done? There was a little conversation about perhaps the city council and them, right, playing some role in that. I think I heard a little bit about the chief talking that it sort of would happen maybe with city council or direct complaints and feedback and a process there. So I think that's what I would like to try to understand as we're working through the process is what are other options that would get us to the same result. So that was something I wanted to pose. So Mr. Newkirk, I know you had your hand up next.
Oh, well, that's what my, look, I believe that people get distracted from the eyes on the prize issue. And there's nothing when I've asked people to talk about some of the barriers that the laws provide, the 400 years, the things you talk about, it's not to depress people and say you can't make change. You can absolutely affect positive change by recognizing that barrier and going around it. And the way to go around it is to realize, what are we trying to do? You want police officers to equally evaluate Black behavior compared to white behavior. That's at a subconscious level, a bias level, barring the racists that we'll throw out of the bin every once in a while. But that's what you want to do. And the only way to do that, there's not a single thing suggesting a citizen review board has any power or ability or knowledge or effectiveness at getting to the heart of that question of actually digging in and ensuring equal evaluation of Black behavior. Right now, if Iowa City was, my question was going to be, if Iowa City next year we do this data and Marion, the data is just like Iowa City's. Maybe it's a little worse. What are we going to do about it? What is the citizen review board going to do about it? Are we going to fire the chief because of implicit bias-driven data? Are we going to fire 20% of the officers and you really don't know exactly what they're thinking? The answer is in the real world, the most effective methodology to ensure change in behavior and accountability and positive policing is effective, strong training combined with the serious levels of accountability. Because what is a citizen review board? It is a methodology of accountability at a high level. And the only thing that social sciences suggested might actually reduce bias, other than some extent training at a deep level, is very specific forms of accountability. Not just any accountability, not just knowing that I could be in trouble, but, for example, if you want to ensure that a performance evaluation is not, biased toward a woman or an African American, you have accountability before you write the evaluation, and then you have accountability after you write the evaluation. You do it at both points in time, and the police department needs to be able to insert that level of accountability within its processes, which again, that's a far more effective approach. And then finally, my only other point, there's a more effective way to do it is my point. And by the way, you can always impose a citizen review board with as much power as you want to if the police fail. If they won't listen to this call for change and the data comes back and there's no progress, and you say, look, the data's bad, you haven't made progress, you're not listening to our training, citizen review board, it's time. That's actually another layer of accountability to ensure that the police department is on the ball. So I think there's more effective ways to do it, is my point. And any comment I make about not doing something is only because I believe that, honestly, it becomes a distraction of what it really takes to actually make change. That's what I believe. It's my personal belief. So it's and there's other ways to do it.
Okay, thank you. I think Cersei, you had something.
Yeah, so our proposals are centered on long-term training and deep engagement. And we actually have quite a lot of information about what the research tells us does lead to changes in practice, because that's what we're ultimately talking about, is what are our changes in practice. And we are happy to share that. That was our understanding. That was going to be a later conversation. It wasn't on the agenda for today, but yes, long-term training actually does lead to changes in practice, and it requires job-embedded coaching to really take hold. And so there's all sorts of things that need to happen that are not currently happening in many police departments around the country and not here. It's not been a part of the way we've organized policing. Frankly, it's a tough thing to get this in schools, which is all about learning, to get the kinds of long-term job-embedded distributed training and practice to move a system and to change it, which is why we need to have forms of accountability. So if you'd like to call it a citizen accountability board as opposed to a citizen review board, that might be a more appropriate term for it anyway. That's what we're asking for, because we know systems don't move if you don't have long-term committed change agents making sure that the system is moving. This is not a brand new issue. This didn't come up last year when George Floyd was murdered. In my lifetime, this is not a new issue. Black Americans have been describing in great detail how they have been experiencing policing in this country throughout my entire lifetime. I'll say that because I was a part of it. I saw it and I knew it. So our systems aren't doing the things that they should be doing. They're not doing that. We need some accountability to make sure they are. That's what we're asking for. We trust and believe people want to. I mean, I've been doing this kind of work myself personally for 30 years in education. The data has not significantly changed in 30 years in education because we haven't put in the sorts of training, which includes a lot of time, frequency distributed over time, and ongoing job embedded coaching. It's in those micro moments in someone's job when you get feedback about what you just did that you learn to change your practice. That's a deep investment in training, and that's what we're calling for. We aren't only calling for a citizen review board. This is not to us a distraction. It is an addition to a broader change movement here.
Okay, go ahead.
So
No,
does that mean someone is reviewing? I'm just curious.
Mhm.
Someone like daily, hourly, by the minute reviewing body cam activity? Is that what it boils down to? Because it relates to accountability. How are you going to do that? Is that because you can have on the job training, and in England they have years of training before they go on the police force. And here, what is it? There's so many weeks, so much. But is it someone looking at a camera on what did Jimmy do all day long? What Bob do all day long? Is that what it is? Just curious. What is micro attention to?
Well, I think that raises the practical question. In the real world in this city, which has not had a history, fortunately, of shootings, strong physical abuse, the real problem, if there's going to be a problem, is going to be the micro level evaluation of Black behavior resulting in quicker stops, stronger stops, more searches, etc. It is going to be abjectly impossible for a group of citizens to look at a camera and decide whether in that specific moment that something happened or didn't happen. Now, an African-American may want to bring that complaint and say, hey, look, I think my gut tells me these cops pulled me over for XYZ to the chief. And the chief's going to say, let's go look at the video camera, is what he's going to do. So the point is that 99% of all the complaints are really going to be all about one thing, the accumulation of massive amounts of data that suggest there is some level of bias in the evaluation of behavior. It's not going to be, 400 complaints, because you'll never be able to tell. That's the point. And so you've got to approach it from my perspective in a different way. And again, it's not that you can't have, again, you can just keep this task force going if you want to and have it be the review board, because again, the amount of complexity you're going to have to establish people who actually have the knowledge and qualifications, short of having a bunch of PhDs on the task force or on the review board. I don't know how you do that, because I'm telling you that, I suppose I could look at something and suggest, I think there's some way this happened, but at the end of the day, there's always going to be some other explanation for why that particular person was pulled over in that moment. It's kind of like, the idea that my grandfather smoked for 80 years and never got cancer means there's no such thing as cancer. When you look at things in the individual moment, it disproves what's going on, or you can't explain it. And you've got to look at it statistically over time. And that's not something that, again, the review board can look at that, but the city council can look at that too. Look at the overall data, which is really what it's all about, at least in my opinion.
Al, and then we'll come back to Cersei.
Just very quickly, because Colette, you indicated you wanted a broader set of strategies to be shared. And to Cersei would be, so is there a community outreach dimension that MAR is looking at? Because I don't see it in any of the things you've spoke about so far. But I do think that a citizen review board, it would be a lot of work just in what we've already talked about, but there should be a community outreach dimension to their work. And it could be small, but let's think big. We know the problem. We just haven't defined it well enough to know how to react to it. And so we are dealing with parts of it. But here in Marion, we do know we've made major movements when we engage the community differently. So I'll just leave it this way. We've had 2 cycles of Imaginate, thinking about fun things that deal with infrastructure in our community. If we had a human-centered Imaginate process, frame what are the top 8 priorities, go through a filtering and set up the plan engaging this community, it would have an effect. It's time for some imagination too, as well as the things that we've been talking about. And it takes that kind of cultural move to get this community excited about it. And I believe it's here. And I believe it's in this space too, but it will come at them differently.
Thanks, Al. So we'll have Cersei and then Josh. I see that your hand is raised and I apologize for not seeing that earlier. So Cersei, do you? Okay. Oh, go ahead, Joshua, if you're ready.
I was ready, but Cersei pretty much hit the hammer on the head when it comes to the citizen review board or whatever board it wants to be called. I heard the questions and my hand was raised a long time ago, which I know you didn't see it because I wanted to hit a lot of what was already said, but Cersei already hit it. And I heard somebody say, well, we already have a city council, or we already have this, or we already have that. Why aren't we just using that? Or we already have a task force. Why aren't we using the task force? Well, it's hard to use a task force that you want to demolish. That's one thing. And then it's hard to say, well, we have a city council that can do that. Why don't we use them? Well, we've already been using it, but it obviously isn't working because we're at this place now. And so while we're having the conversation that we're having now, and my also thinking is this, that this thing, well, this the community review board might not be the best option. I honestly believe it could be a great option. It's only a piece of a tool that has yet to be used and has more room to be, it has a lot of room to even be adjusted, but yet it has not even been considered because we think it's just too much, or we don't have enough to do, or we don't think it'll work. Understanding, and it's, yeah, we're not Cedar Rapids, and yeah, we don't know where the line trickles from Cedar Rapids to Marion, but who's to say that some of the things that trickle from Cedar Rapids doesn't trickle into Marion? And the question you want to ask yourself, do you want to have it and be prepared or not be prepared when it comes? That's my statement and my question.
Thank you, Joshua. I apologize for not seeing your hand. So thank you for continuing to be patient. I'll try to keep an eye on that. Cersei,
No problem.
Did you have something to add, Cersei?
Yeah, I was going to actually just respond directly to your question because I think it's a great one. We would never suggest that the Citizen Review Board would be poring over real-time CAM data. We would suggest that someone in the police department needs to be doing that and needs to be coaching police officers as a result and in response to that. Or maybe there's a different way that it is done and can be done, which we'd love to hear. That is the sort of training and support. When you're looking at it through a lens in the case that we would call for of race, that you can discover some of those practices that we may not even realize are having disproportionate impact, but they end up with disproportionate impact when you look at the numbers. Many of those practices are ones that we would outright see. You are treating, I want to say citizen, but I want to say resident, I want to say even a visitor. You are treating someone you're engaged with in ways that are not appropriate given the lens of race that we want to understand better in our community. So yes, someone needs to do that. And that should be someone who is professional, highly trained, and well paid, and probably on the police department's payroll. Maybe not, maybe it needs to be on someone else's payroll. We're not suggesting that's the citizen role. The citizen's role is to make sure that's happening, is to say, what kind of data are you seeing? What kind of progress are you noticing as you're coaching your officers through this change process? How are you shifting what you're doing if you're not seeing change? It's a board, an entity, a group of external folks that don't have a stake in the same way that someone hired by the police department would have a stake in the outcome to make sure things are happening that are supposed to happen. And yes, it typically the best citizens review boards they train their people who are coming on. It's a deep investment of time and commitment. And to ask a city council member who's already having to learn about planning and zoning and, I mean, all the different things, to now have that level of work and responsibility to have oversight at really a pretty particular level of oversight for a police department, I think is too much to ask.
Okay.
Tom didn't pay me to say this, but I'd say, Tom,
So we'll go to Tom and then we'll come back to Amal. Go ahead, Tom.
But as I'm listening, I think there's two things. One's a review board in which that's going to be a group that's going to review and analyze and make a determination. And then there's a lot of policy conversations that go on. And even at the council level, the council sets a lot of policy, but there's not a lot of review from the perspective at that detailed level that occurs. So I think it's difficult to have one board that can not only set policy, but also make a determination on something as micro as it's being talked about. So I think that's something that's going to take a pretty robust group of folks that can evaluate and make those determinations, even with a great deal of data and resources. And then, so I just wanted to make that comment. It sounds like we're starting to evaluate the review board against whatever we have in place now. And I'm just my question, it's more of a question than anything. From the conversation that we're having tonight and have had, we're really trying to figure out how to address the concerns that are being brought forward. That's correct? So I think it's great conversation. I do think that there are ways to look at what we have in place and try to bring back or have a conversation about how they can address the issues that are being brought forward in a manner that's not necessarily the review board that's being proposed, or only the Civil Rights Commission, or only the City Council. So I think given the opportunity to take this all in, I think, and to be able to respond and see how it works within the systems that are there, and not create something new just to create something new, but to bring that back in the form of a conversation would be pretty important.
Thanks, Tom. Amal, did you have something?
Yeah, correct. We want to get to the root cause of what we're trying to do here, and we'll figure out, I'm sure for any problem, there are 100 maybe alternatives for a solution. I just want to respond to Circe's request on having that citizen review board just to have access to the data. The data is there, and the whole community already has that power. Everybody in this community can demand information from police. So the fact that the body cam is there in itself, doing all of the work from my perspective in terms of accountability. It tells the officer that you are being watched and you are held accountable from your employer's perspective and also from the citizens. We work for the citizens of Marion. Everybody from this community can come forward and request any type of information, especially if they're pertain to themselves, and they can come and speak to council and address council at any council meeting and bring forward their concerns and suggestions. Sometimes we listen to all concerns about sidewalks and birds. We're not caring about the environment, especially. So I'm thinking council will have the attention, will give the attention that if someone really indeed being impacted by our officers, or one of our officers treated them differently, we have that avenue. And also we have the Civil Rights Commission avenue. Anybody can come forward with a complaint. uh, with that being treated unfairly, not given equal opportunity. So that there we have two avenues, and then we have this data collection system, body cams, data being collected, and we are investing in a new system to make it better. All of it is available, and all the citizens have the higher power.
Okay, thank you, Amal. Yes, Chief.
Just on the body camera review stuff, and this is my fault for probably not bringing some of this out. We've already got a policy where our sergeants randomly pull body camera of the people on their shifts. They're mandated, I forget what the number is. They're mandated to watch a certain number of videos every week, randomly. It doesn't have to be associated with an arrest. It doesn't have to be associated with anything other than they pull it up, they see it downloaded, they click on it, they watch it. And they're looking for, are they following policies? Are they treating people with respect? Are they doing the things that they're supposed to do? But again, I understand if you think somebody else needs to do that, you know, we can have that discussion. As far as, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, and don't read anything into this about my feelings about a review board or a non-review board. But Joshua had a point that, you know, the citizen, we need a review board because the city council was already in place and is not working. I would just point out that Iowa City's had a review board since I got here in 1999, and every bit of that data about racial profiling came during that time. So is that really an effective way to alter the behavior of the police by a civilian review board? And I'm not way down in the weeds with the Iowa City board on what authorities they have, but if we're looking for something that's actually going to make a difference, maybe we need to think outside the box of even those two parameters.
Okay, so I see it's 7. I'm not going to sort of shut us off right at this moment because I think we've got a couple comments. I saw Jennifer and I think Mr. Newkirk. And then if you've got something, we'll let you provide voice, and then I'll wrap it up and we'll talk about next steps or the agenda for next time, perhaps. So Jennifer, you've been waiting.
Thank you. So, you know, while I was listening to this, I was trying to think of what does the structure, you know, what are options for the structure and what do we have in place, and listening to, you know, looking at it from a metro standpoint versus a city standpoint, and looking at the Civil Rights Commission and as an example of an entity that the Marion Civil Rights Commission works with the Cedar Rapids Civil Rights Commission, which then works with the state. So it's like it helps cover all of those levels. And so I think that when we're looking at the structure, you know, there's already something in place that helps there be a metro approach being done. And the other thing that I had is thinking about, you know, I appreciate what you said, Chief, about that the sergeants do randomly look at the camera footage to see. And I wanted to get a clarification on, if I, as a citizen, hear of Officer X that is causing problems, does it have to be related to me in order to watch that body cam? Or can anybody, because one of the issues that I see when it becomes like a review board and you have to bring a complaint is you're already talking about a marginalized population, and there's extra barriers to feel safe enough to bring forward a concern. And so that's why I'm just wondering, like, is a review board necessary because it can like mask the person's identity to help provide some protection?
Okay, I think, go ahead.
You have an answer to the body camera piece?
Yeah, that'd be great.
If you're not the person involved, probably not. We probably would not allow somebody to look at it. And the reason I say that is we deal with people, harassment cases, we've got child custody cases where people routinely make stuff up about each other and then kind of put us in the middle. And so that kind of puts us in a trick bag with that. We've got the privacy issues as well that we have to deal with. So probably not. Not to say that I couldn't look at it and have a conversation about it, but
Okay.
If there was a board in place, if there was a board in place, then they would be able to look at it.
I see Kara's got her hand raised, so I wonder if she wants to, if she's can, if maybe that's what she wants to step in and help us out.
Me on this one, but
Yeah. Kara,
So this is actually something that the chief and I had a conversation about last week, is that we have to weigh every time those requests come in, we do have to weigh the privacy of the people involved. Like, for example, even if something could be released under the Iowa Open Records Act, it may be something where we don't release it unless it's redacted because we need to protect the identity of a minor, or we don't want to release something to the public, like, for example, from a domestic abuse situation or from a sexual assault situation where it may give identifying information about a victim, because we don't want to have a chilling effect on people calling in and reporting crime either, for fear that if they call and the police respond to their home, then they would be open to potentially having that in the public arena. And so we do need to be careful about protecting public interests and things like that. But if there was a specific purpose, it's certainly something that the chief and I could review together to determine whether or not it could be released.
thanks, Kara. Mr. Newkirk, did you have something?
Yes. I just wanted to note that accountability takes many forms. And in my opinion, Mars efforts and pressure, which is good pressure, to keep pressure on this task force and to keep these issues in the fore are incredibly important to pushing change. And one of my last arguments of why you don't do a citizen review board at this time is because I'm telling you, the pressure that might happen is worth more than it actually happening. You're just not gonna, it's not going to make a difference. And what I've always been afraid of is what happened in Iowa City. Oh, you got your citizen review board, that's enough. And they don't really dig into these issues for the right way. That's my view. And I believe one thing we can tie this to for the next meeting or the follow meeting is when we communicate this to the public, let's let the public know and have a service message from the chief saying, if you have an issue with one of my officers, come down here and we'll watch the video together. You will not be retaliated against. There are ways to protect you. That can be just as effective as anything else in terms of ensuring lack of, more comfort level in the community of knowing that they can be heard, that they can bring these complaints forward. So those are the last things I wanted to say, and then we can, hopefully can move forward to the next meeting.
Okay, thank you. So, yes.
I've got one last thing, and it's more for the chief. On your website, there is a complaint form. Got a question or two about that, but that's for another discussion. Where does that go when someone submits a complaint about an officer or an activity that happened with the police department? Who gets that complaint form?
it goes through the admin assistant.
Okay, so there's already a mechanism to file a complaint with the police department that's not being utilized, I gather, to the extent that all the discussion that we're having right now. So how does that get pushed out to the community and saying that if they have a complaint, if there is profiling that's happening, are you getting complaints through this form or submitted to you, or?
Not many, no. They kind of run the gamut though. I mean, it runs everything from complaining about the way the officers handled a call to, whatever. But we've also got the city council. The city's website also has a complaint
form,
portal on it. So I get some of those from Alicia and Rachel come to me as well.
Okay, there, one last comment. We need to get clarification. City council members do not handle complaints themselves as far as doing the investigation.
It depends. I think it's multifaceted, right? So when a complaint comes in, yep.
Somebody.
Absolutely. When a complaint comes in, we're not often the experts, but we are the voice for that resident. So we reach out to city staff. They help us figure out what is happening. So we or the city staff can respond back to the resident. And then we will take that information depending upon what it is. And sometimes it's brought up in a discussion at a city council meeting in encouraging our staff to look at revising a policy. A prime example I will give you is this winter, if you remember, we had some snow and we had some really cold weather. And we had a couple of residents that received a citation, I think is what you call it. I'm not sure. They didn't have their sidewalks cleaned in the time frame that the city has as one of our ordinances. And they had, the citizens had reached out to a couple of us city council members. We reached out to our Parks and Recs folks. We had conversation. We worked back and forth with the citizens or the residents. And upon reflection, there was a determination made between the residents and city council that perhaps we needed to revise or review and revise our ordinances and policies, which then we went through a process and we did that this last year where, if I remember, we extended the time frame from maybe 12 hours to 36 hours, I think it was. So that would be an example of how that works when a complaint or a concern comes through the process that we currently have. Did that answer your question?
Well, not exactly.
So
What I-
ask me differently so I can answer it
Well,
then.
Let me speak. What I was trying to say is that you're not going to handle an investigation because it's been pointed out the council's got too many things on their plate right now. You're not specifically going to do the yeoman's task of handling a complaint. You're going to help orchestrate it, push it along, try to resolve it, but you're having others giving you input and feedback from what they've done in their investigative role, which I would assume would also be if you were handling complaints like for the police chief. You're going to contact him. He's going to get you the information. He's going to do a lot of legwork, feed it back to you. You're going to come back and make some kind of decision, which would still allow you in this format to be able to do that and not be overly burdened with that. So what I'm doing is just saying to throw that at the council as a reason why the citizens board, because you've got way too much work, isn't a valid argument. Because you're not doing it specifically, but you are part of the process. And the process can go on as a result of that.
That is, I think that's an accurate assessment based on how we do our work and how we work with the city staff in resolving questions, concerns that folks bring forward.
Okay.
Yep, you bet.
Thank you.
Okay, so I see I feel like we're at a place where we can kind of pause for a moment, talk about just I think, overview of this evening and then what comes next for our agenda next time. I took 3 pages of notes, which is pretty impressive. They're probably not as good as your notes, but I got 3 pages of notes over here. I think what I heard through and through was this sense of accountability, which was used several times, and in particular accountability with our equitable policing, and that there's a variety of ways in which we can respond to this accountability. In addition to that, I also heard quite a bit about reviewing some data and this ongoing need for training and perhaps remediation attached to that training, right? So as we may discover things that need to be remediated in this process. So those were just some things that I had written down. Talked about the citizen review board or accountability board as being one way in which we could have accountability. We heard about Civil Rights Commission and maybe some of their work that they've been doing around accountability. Talked about the micro level accountability, which is sort of intertwined, I think, a little bit with the Citizens Review Board, but could be seen distinctly different. And then I also heard that there's maybe some current practices and policies that exist that may respond to this idea of accountability. What I think might be a good next step is to hear a little bit more about, I don't know that we got a lot today about that current practices and policies that could possibly do this work for us. So I wonder if in the next agenda, we need to hear a little bit more about that. Because where I'm trying to go with this, I think, is our goal of getting some recommendations to bring to the city council to do this important work. And that's a space in which I feel like we need a little more investigation on. Tom, I think, volunteered maybe to help us guide that conversation next time. Be careful when you speak up, right? But I get a sense there's some opportunity for us to do some learning there. So then this group can have some, I think, start to make some decisions about what are some recommendations we're going to think about bringing forward. And another recommendation perhaps was, I heard a little bit of discussion about, is it the task force that continues to move forward with this work? I'm not sure that folks think that that's the right decision, but I do think that if we get some more information on what you can provide, Tom, with the rest of your team, that can be an agenda item this next time, and perhaps then start to think about where are we at? Let's get a temperature on where this group is, in the sense of what are some recommendations that we feel like we're getting close to bring forward to the city council. So thoughts, questions, comments on that? Yes, Mr. Newkirk.
Again, part of the role that I play is you can either keep this task force going for a very long time, which is perfectly fine with me, I don't care, or you can bring it to closure. And your choice to think about for next time is, there are certain things that simply cannot be resolved. Ms. Stumbo pointed out a couple of them. You cannot resolve it in a couple of months. You cannot resolve the internal policy and practice review of the city that Kirsten's working on. That's going to take her at least another year, and that's probably a good day, would be my guess. The data collection is continuing. That's another, the data won't be collected in any effective way for another year, and then you've just got a year of data. So the point is, you're going to have to reconvene at some point and evaluate this thing. So getting to a point of, can you make recommendations that are tied to the positive things you've come up with, but that also have considerations in the future? Or as a task force, do you want to just keep going? I mean, that's a decision you all need to make that I can't make for you, but we're going to try and bring to you what progress has been made and what things are going to be done, but are continuing process improvements. In other words, Kirsten can't report to you all the things she's done because she's now doing them, and it's going to be going on. We can't report to you all the details of training because it hasn't been done yet, but it's going to be done. And so that's kind of what you need to decide as a task force. I mean, do you want to hang around and get all the individual details of every single thing that's going to be done? Or can you trust the city to do its work and then come back and evaluate the stuff, the data, the training at the time to see if it's been done? So that's just a thought bubble there for you for next time to start thinking about.
Okay, so I think we've got a game plan for our next meeting. Go ahead, Cersei.
I'd like to request that we get a copy of your slides that you shared today. And I'd like to request that we get information about this micro level accountability system that we've never ever heard of before. So we have time to look at it before the next meeting. And I would like to propose that we spend at least 15 minutes back on this question of what is the problem we're trying to solve. And I would specifically like to offer that we could bring a scenario around which we could have some discussion that I think would shed light on what is the problem we're trying to solve. It's an offer I'd make. It would take maybe 15 minutes of conversation. I'm okay if people don't want to do that sort of thing, but it's a way to answer that question of what does this look like on the ground.
Okay.
I'd like to add that if we could add to that resource information so that we could have a little homework, 2 documents, I think it'd be appropriate that we see the ordinance that our neighbor Cedar Rapids has set up for their citizen review board. Secondly, that we take a look at the unbiased policing policy of the city of Des Moines, so that we can see some exemplars. We can throw them away, but we need some exemplars that inform us. And if we did that collectively, we would be talking a little more specific.
Right, so let me make sure that we've captured this. So some additional information on the Citizen Review Board, both from the city of Cedar Rapids and then also what they've got in Des Moines. So
on unbiased policing.
Unbiased policing.
And that would be added to Cersei's request to
Okay.
preparation in between these lines.
Okay, and then also, I think I heard Mr. Newkirk say the idea of sharing with us what has been done and Kirsten maybe can help us do some of that as well. So we've got a pretty full agenda. I think, did you have something too before we close out?
Beat this horse till it's gone, but if Iowa City's doing something wrong, let's get a hold of what they're doing and benchmark what they're doing wrong. I'm not an advocate of saying yes or no on the CRB, but what are they doing wrong? If they got 20 bullet points and 15 of them don't work, then let's use the 5 that do. You know, so if you can get their policy on their CRB, it'd be good to review as well.
I would note that CRC provided a lot of information on Citizens Review Board, a lot of details. And so there's there's a short version and a long version in there explaining what it is and exactly what, at least their current proposal is to how it should work. So I think that's already in there. And the second thing I would say is, with respect, being from Des Moines, I would not look to Des Moines as your guide. I'm just telling you. But
Okay.
that's just me.
Not Boydton, but is there a place that we house this information in a single place electronically in Google or whatever, so that everybody has common access to our files?
I think, can we attach it to the agenda for next time? And then it's just, they have access to it that way. Is that okay? Yes. Okay. So it sounds like if we can get those resources to Alicia, then they can be part of the agenda, and then we will all have access to that online. Is that accurate, Alicia? Yep. Okay, so you can get that information to Alicia, and then we can get it attached to the next agenda for folks to take a look at. Thank you. Okay.
Are we gonna do the data discussion next time also?
Yes, we've got a full docket. Next meeting, we will do the data collection. Absolutely. We talked about pushing that to the next meeting, talk about a little bit more about opportunities that we already have in the city for this work. We'll have some homework to read before we come. And then we'll talk a little bit, if we get to it, right, what this equity task force, is this long-term, short-term? Are we to a place where we're going to start thinking about recommendations? So let's sort of see, I think we start with that, and then we can build from there for our following month's agenda. Okay. With that, I'd like to adjourn the meeting. Have a very good night, and thank you so much.